Constellation. In the name of the committee, I wish you a happy new year to you, your institutes, a year under the merciful gaze of the God who always accompanied his people. As we organized this assembly, the sisters, or the members of the Constellation Committee, thought that in harmony with the Church and the thoughts of Pope Francis, we could deepen a theme that is so dear to the life of the Christian community and to consecrated life, such as the theme of holiness. The publishing of Pope Francis's exhortation on holiness in our contemporary world, Gaudete et Exultate, echoes in us that call to sanctity that is characteristic of our lifestyle, while incarnating it in our present context with its challenges and opportunities. We asked Father Cencini to help us reflect on this theme, on the theme of the prophecy of holiness in consecrated life today. We thank him for his availability, and we are certain that his sharing will help us in this reflection, so that through our experience, we may continue being more fruitful in this world and for this world, without being afraid to aim high and to let ourselves be loved and liberated by God. The exhortation says, do not fear to let yourself be driven by the Holy Spirit. Holiness does not make you less human, because it is the encounter between your weakness and the strength of grace. As Leon Bloyd used to say, in life, there's only one sadness, the one of not being holy. In the afternoon, we will continue working in our annual assembly, but now I give the floor to Father Cencini. I asked him how I was supposed to introduce him, because there's always this issue about the resume, etc. And he said I only had to say, that's why I will obey, that I was only supposed to say that he is one who aspires to get into heaven. This is what he asked me to say to introduce him, so I now give him the floor. In fact, that is the most important thing we can say about ourselves, about to be candidates for heaven. All the rest is of lesser importance. So as we share this hope to find each other again in heaven when the time comes, we will share some reflections today on this theme, on this interesting theme, so essential in our life, because to be candidates for heaven, in other words, means candidates, how can we say? To be candidates for heaven means to also be candidates to holiness, right? Sanctity, right? Our holiness will explode in heaven. But in the meantime, there are some micro explosions here on this land, since holiness can also be manifested in our mortal flesh. And consecrated life wants to be one of these little manifestations of holiness. So let us reflect today on what it means to incarnate this ideal, to make it, turn it into an ideal that can be used by everyone, so that we can live sanctity appropriately when we manage to manifest an ideal that everybody can actually adopt. A good testimony means to make this beauty I've discovered accessible for you as well. It is not a good testimony to say something that others cannot experience. That would be a lack of respect, as if to say, I can experience it, you cannot. You can just admire me from a distance. This would not be an authentic, a true manifestation of holiness. Consecrated life emerged as an announcement to say that it is possible, to participate to God's holiness on earth. And we live this testimony correctly if we share it and if we make it accessible. We give testimony of a beauty that everybody desires and that they can translate into their everyday life. As you see in the outline, my presentation will be divided in two parts, and I hope I can share everything I've prepared, but if I don't, then it doesn't matter. I would like to call your attention on the sense of the crises we are experiencing, because in order to understand this prophecy of holiness, we need to understand the historical situation we are experiencing in its even in its ambiguous aspects or negative aspects, or at least that seem to be negative. I will dedicate some time to this analysis because I think that a diagnostic is important if we want to understand the therapy and if we want to offer an appropriate therapy. In order to offer this therapy, we have to reach a diagnostic of the situation. And secondly, the second part will be dealing with the actual prophecy, trying to underline a few aspects. Otherwise, the theme would be way too broad. I will just give some hints to perhaps then spend some time on the formation aspect, not in the sense of initial formation, but in the sense of the path we are all carrying forward, that is ongoing formation. Can you all follow, even the translators who have efforts in these cases? Anyhow, let us begin with the prophecy precisely. Today's crisis will lead to a church that will have lost much. It will become small and will have to start again, more or less, from its beginnings. This church will not be capable of inhabiting the buildings it built for itself during prosperous times. These buildings will be too large. With the diminishment of the faithful, it will also lose most of the social privileges. It'll be a church that will be more spiritual, that will not have a political mandate flirting with the left wing or right wing. It will be poor and will become the church of the poor. This process will be long. But when all the labor will be finished, there will be a large power emerging from a more spiritual and simplified church. At that point, humanity will discover that it inhabits a world of great solitude, and having lost track of God, they will feel the terror of the horror of their poverty. And at that point, they will see a small flock of believers as something that is completely new. They will discover it as a hope for themselves, such as the answer they always sought in secret. This is the text of a prophecy pronounced in 1968. Exactly 50 years ago. It's the 50th anniversary of this prophecy. Who is it by? Have you recognized it? The young Professor Ratzinger. In early times, he spoke about this great movement of a transformation of the church, foreseeing these two phases. One, a negative phase of loss of power in numbers and works, and a positive stage, a positive phase of rediscovery of our faith, identity, and mission. So my suggestion, my proposal is we can see in this 50-year-old prophecy made by this illuminated person who was and still is the Professor Ratzinger, we can see what can we read in this prophecy? A prophecy that can perfectly be applied to consecrated life. Instead of church, we could mention consecrated life and repeat the prophecy we've just read. It is a prophecy that is announcing a phase of a sort of diet, a sort of a dietary treatment, the numbers that are diminishing, the works that are less, the buildings we built in times of growth in numbers that we can no longer occupy. They're too large. We all have problems about what to do with these buildings that have become too large for our numbers. So there will be this phase that we can see as a kenosis, a reduction, a tightening, loss of a certain power in church and society. But this phase will be the condition, the requirement for a rebirth. Ratzinger speaks of labor as you speak of the labor of a woman who's giving life to a creature, and that will be so for the church and consecrated life. This is my proposal. The title was prophecy. Here is a prophecy. The prophecy does not so much speak of the future. The prophet does not foresee the future. The prophet speaks the truth. It is different. We have an idea about this prophecy. The prophecy is something that reveals the future. No, actually, the real prophecy spoken in the name of God is what says the truth. And this is the truth for us. The truth of what Paul says in the hymn of kenosis, the two traditional stages, the lowering, the kenosis, and the elevation that provides, when God provides a name, he only can provide. This is the proposal. Believing in this prophecy means to give to our institutes and consecrated life a specific perspective which allows us to live, to experience this phase we are living now. It is a negative phase. It is critical. And we perhaps have already shed some tears about this. And during the second phase, we will speak about these tears and how important they are. Okay, in light of this prophecy, which already provides a positive perspective, I think. Let us try to understand this moment we are experiencing, this crisis. We do not need to say that we are in a crisis because you are saying this to me as general superiors. You are the first sentinels that are actually noting and verifying the situation. The problem is, how are we to interpret this crisis? what meaning do we give to this crisis? Because we could see this crisis in a completely pagan manner. There are ways, there are words, there are expressions, feelings that are expressed about this, and they speak of a concerning lack of faith. So how are we reading, interpreting this crisis? How are we accompanying our institutes in interpreting this crisis? When a general superior, the authority in an institute, has an important task in this respect. A general superior cannot be the one that is actually expressing the complaint or lamenting. She cannot be the one directing the choir in the Greek tragedies, you know, when the choir enters and there's tears and crying and desperation and different depressions. No, the general superior is extremely important. She's not only the one who shuts down houses and opens new ones. No, the general superior is especially the person who helps reading, interpreting the meaning of the history that we are experiencing. This is your first task. It is not among the main tasks. It is the actual first task, to help the sisters read this history that we are experiencing. So let's make this diagnosis correctly, so that we do not speak as this author when he says, I can personally witness religious people who, disappointed by their own situations and their institute, wish to experience as soon as possible a beneficial vocational heart attack. I had never heard these two words put together, a vocational heart attack or infarctus, you know, a sort of a euthanasia by exhaustion. I mean, we're going to extremes here. This is an extreme of a pessimistic and negative interpretation. I hope that these religious sisters he's mentioning are not those in authority. We definitely do not want to join in this choir of depressed and people, especially those who are interpreting this situation in this manner, substantially in a pagan manner. So let's try to understand this crisis. Allow me to start from afar. We need to understand that this crisis in consecrated life, we are here at the stage of diagnosis. This consecrated life stems from a general crisis in Christianity, and this is no news, a crisis that speaks of many negative aspects, but let's look into it. We see all the effects of a progressive secularization, a secularization that has brought to a reduction in the number in Christians, especially in the Western context. However, the effects of this process of secularization are not all negative. What does it mean? It means that today we would no longer have a traditional Christianity, a conventional one. We are increasingly going toward a Christianity by choice, based on personal conviction, a Christianity that stems from a process of conversion. That is, we are living a time where faith is no longer transmitted through a system of conservation. You know, time ago, the faith was transmitted from parents to the children. The person was born in a Christian context. There were the sacraments, baptism, got married in church. There was a system of transmission from parents to children. It is no longer like this. And some even say, oh, how beautiful it used to be. Actually, this new time means that this will increasingly be a Christianity by conviction and not tradition, not because it is the way of the mass, not because the social system is oriented to a certain type of traditions. It will increasingly be a Christianity by choice, coming from a conviction, a conversion, from a proposal made to the single person, no longer a sort of automatic transmission and conservation system. Because you find yourself being Christians by force, by habit, because you are just pushed by the masses to participate to liturgy, sacraments. So this Christianity by choice, by personal conviction, will be more determined by a vision of God, a call. So the vision of something important, something significant that you adhere to because it is true, good, and not just because everybody always did this. In fact, this is not something new because since the beginnings of history, Tertullian, I'm mentioning an author of the early centuries, used to say, you are not born Christian, you become Christian, as Tertulliano used to say. You're not born Christian, you become. And he was right. Then what happened? As of the 5th century, at the time of the Christianization of the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire that opened to the Christian faith with Constantine, etc., the situation was reversed. So some Christian author could write as of the 5th century that you were born Christian. You do not become Christian. It's natural. One day you're just born Christian. You're born with this impulse, this instinct that will guide you toward a certain direction. You don't need to impose it from outside because it's natural. It's just normal. So you're already born Christian. Fine. Well, dear sisters, today we are going back to the Tertullian time. We're going back to the truth in the words of Tertulliano, who said something that is very real. You are not born Christian, you become Christian. Actually, you can become. It is a free choice. It is not an imposition, not psychologically, not sociologically or culturally. It is a choice to be made by the person. So how will Christian communities look? Well, they will be small, based on the quality of relations and not the scriptures or social organization. And the pastoral, the apostolate will be a proposal that faces life, not a conservation that needs to be repeated. Something is broken in this transmission system. We see that we no longer have this secure system, mother transmitting to the child. It is no longer like this. And it is not necessarily bad. It is already a prophetic aspect to say that this is the tendency, the trend. So, of course, if we're going toward the Christianity by choice, by conviction, by personal conviction, conversion, and no longer a mass Christianity, well, clearly Christians will increasingly be less. There will be like a sort of a cleaning up. There is a process. There is a process of disposal. It is a term that is kind of related to trash, right? But there will be a disposal of Christians who were Christians just by public records, based on public records. In this church, the people are lesser because there's been a sort of progressive and gradual disposal of those who are Catholics or Christians only based on public records. Of course, these will feel less and less need to participate to sacramental life. So it is normal. It is natural that churches and institutions experience this contraction, this reduction in numbers, because of course those who were Christians only based on the registry office abandoned this way. So we are going toward this type of society. We have to understand this. It is a process that we are already living, and it is not necessarily entirely negative. So despite this inevitable process, there are still bishops, major superiors, or parish priests and consecrated people, communities and catechists who are increasing their efforts to bring things back to the way they used to be 50 years ago. In this case, this is an apostolate generosity that is ill-guided. It can only lead to disappointment and frustration, which is the contrary of prophecy. Those who have a stiff neck and with a stiff neck are looking back and saying, oh, remember those beautiful times when we were so many, the churches were full and our novitiates were overflowing. Remember when we were at the table, we were so tight, we were so many, and look at the crisis now. You see, there are those who keep regretting and keep looking back. This is the contrary of prophecy. Those times, dear sisters, will not come back. They will not be back. Is that clear? Is it clear in every single language? Those times will not be back. And we should not say this with a sense of disappointment, because it would mean we have not understood the prophecy. So let's take a step further. The waters have broken. This too needs to be translated. We use this term at the time of to give birth, right? It is the time of the giving birth. I'm talking to a female context here, so I think that this is an expression that is on point. It is beautiful, just as life is beautiful, and just as giving life is beautiful. The waters have broken, the waters broke, and this is our situation today. The waters broke. Actually, the waters are breaking, and when the waters break, what does that mean? That the woman is approaching the moment of giving life to a new creature. How beautiful. We are living this moment today. We are halfway there. The choice of this expression, the waters breaking, is already a positive evaluation. It interprets this current unbalance as a process toward a new life. What does it mean? It means that what we are experiencing today is not the end of the world. It is the end of a certain world, a certain religious world. It is not the end of Christianity, as somebody says. It is the end of a certain Christianity. It is not the end of faith. It is the end of a certain way of believing. What was being transmitted automatically, which not always caused a personal path by choice, a subjective choice, determined by a conviction, determined by the beauty of a proposal, determined by the beauty of that face of God that is being announced. It is beautiful. I choose to be a believer. So it's not the end of faith. It is just the end of a certain way of understanding faith. We can also say it is not the end of consecrated life. It is the end of a certain way of intending consecrated life. In fact, I think that the Christianity we are faced with, is not worse than the one that is behind us. How are we supposed to, how can we regret a Christianity of obligation, of habit, conservation, or maintenance, the maintenance of faith, simply maintenance of faith? And how can we not rejoice when we see a Christianity of grace, freedom, a Christianity that is the consequence of a free act, of a choice to believe? And I choose to believe based on the beauty of the proposal that I received, the beauty of that face of God that is being revealed and manifested to me. So I make a choice, a conscious choice. A community cannot just live on the maintenance of old tradition, as holy as these may be. You need some youth, so you need to be in love. It feeds on the joy of the discovery. How can we look on this Christianity of the norm, of the rule that needs to be observed with nostalgia, this rule that has to be observed in every single situation and that must function? How can we not capture the beauty of this Christianity that is born by choice, that stems from a choice, and it is fed? It is born based on a personal choice, and it is then fed, and it grows through the choices you make, through our own discernment, by constantly and continuously choosing. This is the only authentic way that can lead to this birth of Christianity inside of us. So we should mention here the logic of Amoris Laetitia. How many people expected the Pope, after the Synod on the Family, to provide a specific norm, a rule, about this several situations that couples are experiencing. These so-called irregular couples, there are several. There's not only one single situation of irregularity, spousal irregularity. So everybody expected the Pope to tell us specifically something about each category A, B, C. For each situation, you should say, these people can have communion. The B category, no, they perhaps cannot receive communion. The third category, yes, maybe after a process. What about the fourth category? Well, many people expected this from the Pope. Pope, you're there for this. I mean, you are the authority. This is what you need to do. Give us a norm, give us a rule, and what should we be doing? And we will be observing it, we'll be applying it. And they used to call this obedience. Are we sure that this is the meaning of obedience? Of course, Pope Francis did not do this. He said something completely different. He said, you, believer, you, big brother, you, big sister, you should try to accompany these people in difficulty, these people who are living this situation of fatigue or even canonical irregularity. Accompany them on a path of discernment to come to understand what it is. What is the appropriate thing to be done at this moment? What is the possible good? This is a different way of being Christian. Pope Francis is inviting us to be the adults who discern. The child is saying, tell me what I'm supposed to do, and I will just obey. I'll observe. I want to be obedient. Is this obedience? Is it perhaps not abuse of authority from the bottom? Do you understand this expression? Abuse of authority does not only come from the top. When a general superior intervenes with authority, with power, it's easy to notice when a general superior is taken by the power. I'm sure it's not your case. No, today there's a risk of having abuse of authority that comes from the bottom. It's very subtle. What does it consist in? It consists in the expectation of, you know, the regular people at the bottom. They demand authority. They demand you to make choices. Tell me what I'm supposed to do. Just show me what I'm supposed to do and I'll do it. But you are the one who has to make the choice. This was the request that was made to the Pope. You tell us what we need to do, we'll obey. And he said, no, you are the one who has to discern. This is the new development. This is what it means to be an adult Christian, somebody who's running the risk to discern. You risk discerning. This is huge. It means trying to understand with your own mind what it is that the Lord wants at this time. You see how everything is connected to spiritual life. Discernment cannot be improvised. You can only achieve it if you have learned it as a regular habit. This is where we're headed. We're headed to this type of Christianity by choice, a Christianity of adult people, people who make personal choices, people who have learned to discern, people who discern at all times, not only in certain circumstances. When, you know, a general superior would call me and say, Father, please come help us. We're having our general chapter. There's two opposed the positions and we're opposed. And how are we to do discernment in the community so we can avoid arguing and discover what needs to be done? And I would say that's not that simple. Discernment is not improvised. You have either learned to discern normally as a normal way of growing in faith, or else you cannot think about improvising community discernment, which is even more complicated. Discernment is the regular way of growing in faith for normal believers. It's a customary manner of living. But this is where we're headed. We're headed to this type of Christianity. So that is why a person such as Pope Francis is so important, as he provokes us in this direction, responsible Christians. So let's go back to our theme. No pessimism, no depression. It is forbidden to complain. We are living like a sort of disenchantment, and this could become an encouragement to be re-enchanted and to a new pastoral passion, but also a way of putting ourselves, of facing the future, a new way of facing the future on the part of consecrated life. A future that can still represent the prophetic aspect of the time and the crisis we are experiencing. So, as we said, let us accept the fact that there's a gradual disposal of Christians, those who were Christians just based on the registry office. So it is normal that this same disposal process will also take place in consecrated life. We must admit it. Many people entered consecrated life through a process that was perhaps not an authentic discernment, authentic choice. So our institutes, of course, have lesser numbers as compared to the past. Let us not feel guilty. Let us not overload ourselves with guilt. We are lesser because we're not faithful. We have rejected the love of one time. No, this is not, we do not need to make this interpretation. It is normal, this process, just as the number of faithful is diminishing. Well, then the numbers in our institutes are also diminishing in our communities. Instead of complaining, let us try to understand better this positive perspective. The waters broke. We can finally question a system which was perhaps not positive. We can still say, oh, how beautiful. We used to be so many in the past. There were so many novices, so many works, so many houses, the presence. We need to understand that through this process, a lot of this reality was not transparent. It was not the result of a genuine choice, discernment, and it risked giving us a certain power of some type, financial power, power coming from a social visibility, even political power, which has nothing to do with the authenticity of consecrated life. You see, even the scandals that we are experiencing, these horrible sexual scandals, these abuse of power, the abuse of money, the abuse of consciousness, the abuse of sensitivity, and even the abuse of other people's bodies. This is the most concerning aspect. All this abuse, all these scandals need to be interpreted correctly. And what does this mean? These scandals lead us to understand to what extent we can go if we are not careful about this process of choice and discernment. However, the authentic choice on the part of a person becomes an evangelical manner of capturing the face of God, of making a choice just because the face of God is beautiful, it attracts me, it calls me, gives me a mission and a service to perform. So what does it mean to really interpret and to adequately interpret these scandals? This is a parenthesis, but I think it is important. These scandals committed by some people, a minority, certainly those who have committed these scandals are a minority. Some people say, oh, but they are so few. Why should we raise such an issue? The great majority of priests, sisters, and brothers are pure and chaste as angels, or almost. So why this all this chaos and this crisis? Why hitting so hard on the church? This is not an authentic interpretation. We should understand it. When these scandals happen in an institution, the scandals of few are usually the consequence of a mediocrity in many people. Did you get this? Did you understand it in English as well? The scandal of a few is the result of the mediocrity of many. Nobody can say that I have nothing to do with that scandal. No one can affirm this. Those scandals belong to me. They are a consequence of a mediocre atmosphere. How awful, a terrible virus, an infection, mediocrity, the loss of enthusiasm, loss of passion. Of course, this then translates into a mediocrity of virginity, mediocrity in celibacy, which is the aspect that speaks mostly of the passion in our heart. Think about how important it would be if we all adopted this interpretation, but if we understood that these scandals belong to all of us. What is the real scandal here? If it is true that the scandal of a few, the scandalous transgression of a few is a consequence of the mediocrity of many, so what's the real scandal here? The mediocrity. Mediocrity is already a scandal in itself. Mediocrity is already a perversion. You see what it means to truly interpret, to really interpret the crisis? But this is not what is happening. I think I can open up another parenthesis and one after the other. I'm working at the CEI to draft the guidelines for the prevention of sexual abuse. So I expressed these thoughts during the commission meetings. Let's prepare a document that addresses everyone and not just those who committed the scandals, so that us, the good, the good people will say, what are we supposed to do when a scandal is reported? Who must we turn to? No, it is not enough to prepare a document that gives these instructions. Let's prepare a document that will address everybody and say, brothers, consecrated people, sisters, these scandals are an issue that concern everybody, not just those few that committed the transgression. Let's speak of a collective responsibility. You see, it was not possible to say this because the jurists said, no, if we speak of collective responsibility, we run the risk of what? What? The bankruptcy of our diocese, that lawyers will say, oh, the responsibility of the diocese, responsibility of the institute, then pay for the damage. The fear that this could lead to a bankruptcy, you see? So because of this, we could not mention this concept of collective responsibility in this document. You see? We do not have this sharing yet in correctly interpreting. And for me, this would be a sign of the sign of a true conversion process that is being carried out, that allows us to recognize, to acknowledge the responsibility of all of us. Only if we adequately interpret these critical situations, only by doing that we can open up to a new future, a new holiness, a prophecy of holiness. But if we do not correctly interpret the crisis, either because we are connected to the past or if because we are not brave enough to acknowledge our responsibility, then there will be no prophecy. Clearly, we will run the risk of remaining attached to a certain type of reality of time that does not open us to the future. But this sense of living this crisis correctly, recognizing a system functions, our institutes are systems, the church is a system. When does a system work appropriately? Is it when everybody is perfect, when everybody has reached sanctity? No, that would be unrealistic. A system functions correctly when it has the courage of recognizing the evil that inhabits in it, when it can recognize it on its own, not because the mass media and the press force us to make admissions, but because the system functions appropriately when it has the courage to recognize its mistakes, and the system works adequately when it recognizes the evil within, based on its own capability, when it can recognize the roots of this evil individually and also from a community perspective, when it is capable of recognizing and acknowledging its collective responsibility, when it is capable of asking for forgiveness, so sharing also the humiliation. There's a humiliation which is positive. This is a positive effect. We need it. We've made mistakes, so let's also feel shame. The system works appropriately when it asks for forgiveness and when it manages to identify new ways to avoid these things from happening again. At that point, the system is functioning adequately. This can also be a proposal. All our institutes have some evil, and we have to acknowledge this through all these processes. If we did all of this, this would be some sort of ongoing formation. If we live this sense of crisis, if we live these difficulties, this would ensure that this crisis, including these awful scandals, this would ensure that all these scandals and critical situations, these situations that are scandalously critical, would become what? Could become what? Would become a moment of formation. If an institute manages to achieve this interpretation. Let's all, if a sister has fallen, if a brother has fallen, let us all face it, and let's take charge of this. This is what Jesus did. Jesus loaded all of this onto his shoulders. Well, we have a different attitude, of course, an attitude of responsibility, but let us all question ourselves so that that crisis can become a providential moment of ongoing formation. The new idea of ongoing formation is precisely this. Formation is ongoing because it goes through life circumstances. The ordinary ongoing formation, the extraordinary ongoing formation happens during those moments when we all come together, the weekends, spiritual exercises, etc. Those are moments of extraordinary ongoing formation. But the real ongoing formation is ordinary, the one that happens every day through life events. The Father forms us. The Father forms the heart of the Son in us through the Spirit by using life situations, even a situation as the one we are experiencing now. The scandals in the church can become a mediation for formation. Of course, it does not happen automatically. It does if we have a process of discernment, a process of interpretation that we do together, allowing us to recognize the hand of the Father who is forming us through crisis as well. The hand of the Father who is forming us through these critical situations. The hand of the Father who's forming us through this situation of poverty that we are experiencing in our institutes, in this reduction in numbers, a loss of a certain sensitivity, of closing the works. The Father is forming us. The hand of the Father, these great hands, can turn everything into grace. Everything is grace, and everything is grace because everything is ongoing formation. It is a formative grace. If we get into this logic, our life is either ongoing formation or ongoing frustration. There's no alternative, sisters. Either our life, our individual and community life is either ongoing formation, that is, we get into this logic of being formed by all of the life circumstances that are a mediation of the Father's formation. Therefore, life would become an ongoing formation. If we do not get into this logic, our life will become a permanent frustration, ongoing frustration, and there's no room for prophecy or holiness in ongoing frustration. It's precisely, there's only room for tears that are then pagan tears, and we would just become complainers. Do I have to stop and take a break? What do you say? I'm a little behind, but we will recuperate. I hope that everything we've said is clear. I hope that what we've seen so far is clear enough and also useful for your life, knowing that everything you'll be capturing that is good or valuable may then be transmitted to your sisters. I think it is important to have this type of meetings during this period, these times that we are living. These aggregate meetings are very important in these times that we are living. If we gather together and try to reflect and adopt one same direction for the future, this could become very significant. It is one of the positive aspects of this crisis. When each was rich in his or her own institution, that we did not need to convene to share. But now that we are in a critical situation, then we feel a greater need to meet, to get together, to share. So these meetings, these aggregate forms are very important nowadays. It's a pity that not everybody feels this need. Okay, before we get into the more prophetic part, we are at 3.5. So what vocational crisis? Because I raised the example of a crisis, the crisis determined by the scandals. Yes, but let's interpret it correctly. There's a message that needs to be captured there, a message that could become very fruitful for us in this process of breaking of the waters, in this these terms we used. Another problem that sometimes takes away the dreams from superior generals is the problem of the vocational crisis. Many of you may have found yourselves discussing this, preparing meetings about the vocational crisis, strategies for vocational promotion, vocation animation. So let's look into this. There's something good and important here too. I'm referring to the Congress, the meeting we held in last March, 9 months ago, in Tirana. Is there anybody from Albania here? No, no one from Albania. But you do have, but this is a meeting that the European Bishops' Conference organizes about vocation. The one in charge of this area. So we held this convention, this Congress in Tirana in 2018. I gave 2 presentations about the vocational situation in Europe and some future perspectives. So we were ready. I mean, the first presentation was going to be very sad, right? The situation is Europe is not that good. So we went to look at the statistics for religious life, consecrated life, all the graphs, the trends, future perspectives. In 2028, there will be 4 of us. You see, all these views and perspectives that are very sad, right? That's a little parenthesis. I belong to an institute, the Canossian Fathers, founded by a woman, which is normal. It's the mother. A mother is the one that gives life. Well, so first she founded the Canossian Sisters, who spread, and then the Canossian Fathers. But the thing is, she died right after. You see, the evil, the bad people say that she died. From childbirth, after founding the Canossian Fathers. The first Canossians were 2 brothers who found themselves alone in this mother community in Venice. There is a train station now there where the first community resided of the male side of the Canossians, and they found themselves alone. They had very difficult times. The foundress didn't even have enough time to write a rule. So we have a female rule in the feminine. We always have to translate into masculine. So to make a long story short, the Institute did not manage to reach the number 3, the 3 people, because the third one would come and the first one died. And we went on like this for a century. For 1 century, the Institute did not reach a number of 3 units. until the second one died as well. In 1925, 1930, the 1 century later, the foundress died in 35. The sisters were spread out right away, but after a century, the Canossian brothers there were only one. There was only one. The only brothers, always two of them until the second one died, and there was only one. So what did he do? He went to the patriarch in Venice and he said, that's it. The work is through. It's over. I'm alone. There's no hope. And the cardinal, the prefect, the patriarch of Venice sent Don Calabria, who was founding his institute, and he said, and he told him to absorb this only religious brother. Father Calabria went there, in obedience, spent some time there, and then came back to the patriarch and he said, no, this work will go forward on its own. And that's how it happened. Little by little, there was a second one. Friar John did not die right away. He held on. And then the third one, the first Canossian priest, was ordained more than 100 years after the death of the foundress. Why am I saying this? Just to say that oftentimes our numbers seem to be headed in a certain direction, but be careful. Let us not start getting into statistics, projections. That's how we call them, projections, future projections, which oftentimes in history were then found to be untrue. So, in this story, I mean, it seemed to be, we thought we were seeing death creeping in, but no, it was all the other way around. The creature was being born. So in Tirana, what happened? What emerged in Tirana? We saw that, in fact, in Europe, there's a reduction in numbers. This is nothing new. But what was interesting is that, of course, we see that in Europe, there's a gradual secularization. Faith is no longer transmitted, as I said before, it's no longer transmitted. There's no longer a conservation of faith. Europe even denied its Christian roots. Along with this phenomenon of a reduction in numbers of vocations, I discovered something else. I discovered there were other vocations that were growing. And this raised some sort of curiosity, and I wanted to understand. And I discovered that in Europe, currently, there's a vocational crisis, but where? In who? In those charisms that are still attached to the concept of conservation of faith. On the other hand, there's an increase in vocations and charisms inspired by another logic, no longer the logic of conservation of faith, but the one of the announcement, the first announcement. In clearer terms, the missionary announcements, those charisms that are emerging in Europe. People feel called to go out on a mission in Europe to make a first announcement. What are we supposed to preserve and conserve? There's no faith. So what are we preserving? Let's open up to the announcement. Let's go into these environments where there's no faith. Let's live our consecration to God as an appeal, a missionary appeal in its true meaning. So I discovered, surprisingly, and I transmitted this in my presentation, I discovered that it is not true that there's a vocational crisis. There's a vocational crisis in some vocations, though traditional ones, those inspired on the logic of conservation of faith. On the other hand, there's an increase in vocations inspired on a different logic. the logic of the missionary announcement. Those are on the rise. New vocations, consecrated, the lay people, lay missionaries, catechists, educators, teachers. There's a change of reference in this objective. There's no longer a simple preservation of what no longer exists. There's an announcement of faith as starting from scratch that goes straight to the foundation of the message, and it addresses everyone in every life situation, every periphery. No longer the Catholic school, those who know go to this Catholic school. No, it's us going out toward the peripheries, toward the pagan environments where faith was never announced. These vocations inspired on this type of charism are on the rise. But you know that then please tell your sisters that if we the traditional religious, let us call ourselves like this, traditional religious, in the sense that we belong to institutions with a certain structure. If we look at, if we embrace, if we put ourselves in these new manners of consecrated life, well, perhaps they are not yet canonically consecrated life, but they're inspired by this. You know that if we sum ourselves to them, we reach a number that is the highest ever reached by consecrated life. What vocational crisis are we talking about? This is a fake news. It's not true. It's not true. Even from the perspective of numbers, if I don't want to attach an undeserved importance to numbers, but even if we look at numbers, there is no vocational crisis. Those speaking about this vocational crisis have to say that there is a vocational crisis in a certain type of vocation, but there's no crisis. There's a new emergence of new vocations inspired by a different logic. The logic that looks at the world in which we live. They understand that faith no longer exists, so we need a charism that puts me in the conditions to make the announcement, to face a pagan environment, to not wait for people to come into my institution. I'm the one who has to go out. And here we have again the prophet, Pope Francis, the prophet, the peripheries. Let's go out to the peripheries. What is the periphery? It is the place where the gospel of Jesus has not yet been announced. This doesn't mean that old institutions are destined to die. No, our charisms, although these were born in a different historical context, we can live these old charisms by opening ourselves up to this new perspective, the one of the missionary announcement, and not simply continue with works that presuppose that others have to come to us. We built a huge building, so now you are to come to us. No, we need to go out. So even that old institute is called to enter, to join this perspective, this new logic that is much more open, more evangelical. Perhaps the most beautiful image is the sower, the sower who is sowing with his wide movement of his arm, and the seeds fall where? The seeds fall on the street, on the highways. How can a seed flourish on cement? But yes, the sower can sow everywhere. Live your consecration as an appeal to make an announcement, even if the more unimaginable places. Who are you to say that it is not worth announcing the gospel in that place? Who are you? Who gives you the right and the authority to say that and that the gospel cannot be announced there. No, let's not go there. It's not worth it. Let's not go announce there. No, let's do it in our institutions as we always did, as our fathers told us. No, you have to go anywhere. Go announce anywhere. You are not the one to decide whether a place can be open or not to the announcement of the gospel. Who are you to decide this in advance? You're asked to announce. So announce anywhere. So anywhere, everywhere, with anyone, taking advantage of any relationship. This is the new vocational perspective, open, a missionary one, without being attached to a single type of reality of work we have institutionalized. Because what these new forms say, I remember that in Tirana, the vocation animator, I think in Belgium, was saying that in his country, in his nation, there's the emergence of an institute of consecrated life of people who have a charism. They choose a charism of committing in political life as Christians. Can you imagine? What imagination, what a novelty. People who professionally choose to be engaged in politics so that politics can be based on Christian principles. You think about such a charism, how current it is, how modern, how it responds to a need. Think about our parliaments. There may be people who believe, but think about today's politics. How is it interpreted? How is it done? We were talking about this in Tirana. We were talking about this common Europe. It is called like that, common Europe. But where is the meeting point here? In finance, in the banks, in the spread, in the GNP, in money? How important would it be to have a person in those parliaments committed to politics, so to worldly things, but referring to Christian principles? Think about today's discussions, the migrants, these ships in the Mediterranean Sea. Think about these politics, these politicians who are really squalid. They are concerning. I don't want to be pathetic, but there's room for this. Think about the importance of a person committed to politics as a believer, as a faithful person. Think about this new logic. Think about the announcement that could be given by a person managing the public affairs, managing social life, inspired on the gospel. This is just an example, and an example of a new form that is emerging with difficulty. I'm praying the Lord, all the angels and saints, so that this project can actually be achieved. But these vocations are on the rise. There's an increase also, you see, right, those who choose to be engaged in politics, those who dedicate themselves in the society are the ones who are rejected in our society. There's the monks in the society. You see these monks who are not on top of the mountain, isolated, where no city noises can reach, but the monks who live in town, within the city, or those choosing to live in abandoned peripheries, those announcing the gospel through modern media, those facing the most extreme situations, those living a life in poverty, in radical poverty, those who choose to announce the gospel where it's never been announced, or in difficult or unlikely environments. This is a prophecy of holiness. This is an open perspective where we too, as traditional institutes, are called to join. Let us start in these new perspectives by recalling this logic, no longer a logic of preservation and maintenance of faith, rather a logic of a courageous and missionary announcement, which must probably also be creative. We need a lot of imagination nowadays. What does imagination mean? It's a nice word, right? But from a spiritual perspective, what does it mean? It means, again, capability to discern, capacity of discernment, to be adults, to not be content with just repeating ourselves. Do you know what difference there is between perseverance and fidelity? Is it the same thing? What's the difference? Microphone. She said we can be persevering in the same institution without being creative, with no enthusiasm. This answer is correct. To persevere, a person who perseveres, or an institution that perseveres, is someone who is living based on the spirit that was received from the past, from tradition. Whereas the one who's faithful is the one who not only remains in the place where he entered, but it is a person who remotivates, who gives new motives for his remaining in that institution. The one who perseveres is a person who repeats himself. Simply somebody who recycles himself, repeats himself on the same again and again. He's still within the institution. He doesn't leave, but he's only repeating himself. The faithful is the one who responds to the new appeals in life, essentially responding to God, because God reveals himself in a new manner every day, to me individually, but also to the entire institution. So even our institutions nowadays risk to only being perseverant, but that's not enough. To persevere means to repeat. Fidelity is creative. Perseverance is static. Fidelity is dynamic. Perseverance looks to the past, sometimes complains, oh, we're no longer there, but we want to continue, we want to resist. Not as those who abandoned us. What does the faithful say? He says, Lord, help me understand what you're asking of me, what you're giving me today. What's the challenge? What's the provocation? The one who's faithful is attentive every day to respond to a God who's always new, who's always new and unheard of. This is the difference. The perseverant is alone in front of his own reflection, in front of the mirror. The fidelity is relational. It is a response to the one who's faithful. Holy scriptures usually say that God is faithful. I've never seen God described as perseverant. This is another appeal that's very useful. This is the fidelity we are called to and that we are called to transmit. I participated to a rite the other day. I even wrote it on the article that will be published in this magazine. There was a celebration of, it was to celebrate the 25th to 30th, as we had all these sisters, a large institute, one with a candle and with her cane, with a walker holding another sister. I mean, it was like, it looked like an army that had come out of a war. 50 years of celebration of 50 years, whatever. And the bishop preached and said, "Good sisters, you're an example of I think he said you're an example of fidelity." It was good. I mean, he gave them a very positive preaching. The sisters had watery eyes. And then the bishop said, "Let's pray the Lord so that you can have today in your 70, 80, 90 years, so that you may have the same enthusiasm that you had it since at the beginning." And everybody was crying. What enthusiasm from the beginnings? What are we talking about? They have to live their consecration today. And today, at the age of 90, I cannot repeat my consecration of that time, perhaps regretting that enthusiasm. No, I mean, 50 years have gone by. God has been revealed. I've discovered new things. I've had experiences, the history, the ministry, thousands of different and difficult situations among the poor, among the suffering. I cannot be changed. I cannot avoid being changed by this. If today I'm consecrating myself to you, God, it is for new reasons as compared to the past. I do not have to run after my enthusiasm 50 years ago. I'm called to live a new passion today, a new consecration for new reasons, so that you, Lord, because you, Lord, have revealed yourself to me during these 50 years. So let's forget about regretting that enthusiasm from the past. It was probably an unrealistic enthusiasm as well. I mean, of those thinking that the consecrated life is God knows what. But today's enthusiasm is much better. How beautiful is it to see a person who's aging, but who's still loaded with a renewed enthusiasm, and who consecrates him or herself to God for new reasons, so that God can be revealed in a new manner through this history. So let us be careful. Let us ensure we have faithful people in our institutes, not only perseverant people who just repeat themselves with no novelty. We gave some concrete examples about the actual prophecy, the prophecy of holiness. This prophecy we're called to live. Somebody may be wondering today, is there a future for consecrated life? Well, I'm not a prophet. I'm not a son of a prophet, but I know one thing for sure, which is if we, consecrated people, are capable of living in response to Paul's appeal. Remember Philippians 2:5, Paul asks Christians to have the same feelings as Christ. For me, this is a beautiful sentence where we can find all our charisms. Because what is a charism? It is a feeling of God. Every charism underlines a feeling of God, underlines something about God's sensitivity. If we live our charisms well, it means to relive that feeling correctly. It perhaps is a different manner of considering charisms, but it is effective. It is good to think that my charism is asking me to identify with that particular feeling of God. It's also an interesting manner of doing a vocation promotion. It's attractive to present a charism like that. Every charism represents a trait of God's heart, of God's face, an aspect of his heart. We believe in a God who's sensitive with feelings. Every charism underlines a specific feeling. I think there is a feeling, there's a way of being, a way of feeling that we're all tend to. What is this feeling? Compassion. Consecrated life in general is as such, is as a theophany of the compassion of the eternal. I love to call God as the eternal one. It gives a feeling of definite, of greatness, and it's moving for me. So what does compassion mean? We all know what this word means. It's not only to feel piety. In Italian, we say that that person makes me feel pity. Compassion means that I am capable of suffering with you. My heart is free of welcoming, of taking in at least a little bit of your pain. I think that this is compassion, and I think that consecrated life finds a sort of general orientation, and all our charisms are attached to this. Somehow each of us is called to live this compassion in specific situations in a particular manner, but we're all called to have a heart that is capable like this because we're consecrated in virginity, so that our heart is free to welcome the suffering of others. A heart that is free, a heart that is virgin and free. Free of what? Of minding its own business? No, free of welcoming the other's pain. So let's ask ourselves, how can this prophetic path be? If we interpreted as I will try to explain, I think we can see in this some very interesting aspects. I will mention something I read that was very strong. I was talking about tears, the courage to cry. Compassion means that I'm allowing your pain to enter my heart. An expression of compassion is tears. Tears in Sanskrit language, in the Indo-European languages, tears means what makes noise. Strange, because tears in this ancient language are means what makes noise. It's peculiar. So if Goyle says that there's a time to cry, we could say that that's the time to make noise. Noise for what? Well, we have cried many tears. We still are. Let's think about the institutional tears. We cry because we cry because of the reduction of vocation. We cry because of the forced closing of our works. We cry the loss of our social or political weight. I mean, you cry for yourself. You cry for those things that are not going your way from an institutional or personal perspective. I don't know if these are blessed tears, you know, those tears mentioned in that Psalm 56. That's a little gem. It's a beautiful expression. We believe in a God that gathers our tears in his wineskin. The Psalms are full of these descriptions. God is the one who gathers our tears in his goatskin, in his bottle. Think about the beauty of this. Think about the compassion that God feels. He does not let our tears fall to the ground. He gathers them all. This God who's listening to the cry of the poor. That's how he reveals himself to Moses in the burning bush. So if we only cry our things, those tears are self-referential. These are bad quality tears. These are not tears of compassion for someone else. These are tears that are only determined by the rage or sadness because things are not going my way. But the tears we should learn to shed today should be different. Noisy tears, tears that make noise, as the meaning we saw. The tears are something that makes noise. We have to learn to cry for those things that are worthy of crying, but in this manner, making noise, not as something very private, something that deserves attention, and something that should not leave anyone indifferent, especially those who want to announce the dignity of human beings, what makes them precious to God's eyes. So, how capable are we of crying for this evil that surrounds us by reason of this violence affecting so many people, violence against the weak, the little ones, those who cannot react, those who are not important in this society, those who are disposed of, we were talking about migrants, those who cannot come to life, those who have no dignity in life, the violence against women still, violence against the poor, the elderly, violence against the sick, violence on earth and against the goods of the earth, violence against the family, those who are alone, violence of very different types that endanger that precious asset represented by peace, harmony, violence that is increasingly becoming terrorism, war, a sort of third world war, as Pope Francis says, in bits and pieces, that has made many shed tears. I realize I'm talking about major issues, but the cautious type, and we have very many cautious types amongst us who have their feet on the ground. You know what it means to have their feet on the ground, you know, the realistic type. The realism sometimes is damned. It prevents us from dreaming. Realism prevents you from dreaming. Dreams are tied to prophecy because prophecy is a dream. So this realism will say that these are problems that are that go beyond us. This violence. I mean, we cannot resolve the issues of migrants, or it's not up to us to deal with all of this. This is the realistic perspective. Realism rhymes with immobilism, to being unmoved. Mediocrity perhaps as well. Mediocrity is a lack of prophecy, the lack of capacity to see what we could be doing to express a compassionate heart. So we must ask ourselves, How do we live this relationship with this evil? What does consecrated life do when faced with this evil? Is it enough for us to pray for peace every day for the poor, for migrants, for the lonely people, for those who are abandoned, raped, abused? I mean, if you come and participate to our prayers, some people call these practices of pity. What is it? How disgusting. What practice of pity is this? If one participates to our prayer, you will hear that we pray for these people as well. It's beautiful to pray for them, but be careful. Prayer should not become an alibi, an excuse, just to say, I've done my own. I've done what I was supposed to do. I prayed. I prayed for peace, right? How many times do we pray for peace? Oh, well, yeah, we're at war. Please listen to us, Lord. Well, I mean, it's okay. It's right. But be careful because it can easily become an alibi. Somebody asks us, well, since you pray so much for peace, where does this peace come from? Does it come from above, from the heavens? Isn't it our consecration to God that should put us in the conditions to scream? Here are the tears that make noise, to scream, to shout, to make noise, to have the courage to play our part as believers all the way, our part as believers in the God of peace, therefore to be makers of peace. Jesus said, blessed are those who build peace, not just who just stick him in prayers of intercession. Blessed are those who are peace builders. We cannot allow ourselves to be neutral and do basically nothing without raising our voices, without feeling obliged to create a culture, a mentality, sensitivity, some pedagogical processes in a certain direction. Isn't this our mission? Shouldn't an institute reflect seriously on this? This is the essence of today's life. We cannot just walk alongside and just think, oh, well, our charism is just to have schools and educate. Of course, it's important to work in schools to create a mentality, formation, but one thing does not exclude the other. We have to create some mentalities that are sensitive to this, but I must feel involved in the first person. Remember, a few years ago, we celebrated the year of consecrated life. Remember? What did we note at the end of the year? Did the world realize that we celebrated the year of consecrated life? Actually, did the church realize? Did the church notice? Why didn't the church notice? Oh, we should be offended. Nobody noticed that we celebrated this year 365 days for consecrated life. We were all marveled when Pope Francis called for this year. But then in the end, you see, it's not even mentioned anymore. Ultimately, what happened? So can we speak of an ecclesial attention to this form of life, which has always been so relevant in the history of the church? So this is what I suggest. Let us avoid being offended. If there was no attention, well, then let's ask ourselves why. Let's ask ourselves, are we significant or are we becoming dumb, unable of speaking words, unable of shedding those tears that make noise? This strain aphasia that makes us dumb, that prevents us from speaking of the beatitudes of peace builders, but it makes us use a language that must necessarily be appreciated by everyone. Let's ask ourselves, how is it possible that consecrated life as an expression of the Spirit's imagination has all of a sudden grown old, and not only because of the increase in the biological age, it's become repetitive, often with no imagination, with a little sense of mission. Let us investigate this, our ability to cry real tears that really make noise, or the tendency to cry about ourselves, or let us investigate this insensitivity that does not allow us to cry at all. It is absurd. It is sad that a consecrated person went as far as using a different type of relationship. We've left our mother, our father, our sisters, our brothers. We've left our homes. A person who has made such a choice, therefore, affecting the more natural ties, the ties that attach a person to another person, how is it possible that this person, when faced with violence of the stronger people, when faced with the hypocrisy of those who say they love the earth, how can a person like that conclude that nothing can be done? How is it possible? We've made this radical choice and we become dumb as we face this reality of oppression. Why is consecrated life so silent? Why is consecrated life, why does consecrated life seem to be so indifferent, as it risks becoming an accomplice in this violence? And that would be terrible. An accomplice because of a lack of courage to denounce, to report. Accomplice in a very real manner as well. We referred to the scandals. We need a counter testimony. We gave a counter testimony in that case, and it has affected the image of what it means to be consecrated to God, with these concerning sexual stories or scandals of all sorts of scandals, abuse of power, abuse of consciousness, abuse of money, a wealth that is very manifest, search for comforts, common mediocrity. It's become such as a collective virus among the people of the church, consecrated people, collectively and individually, in times when many people are experiencing situations of poverty and discomfort and major discomfort. As stated a lady working in an institute, when in the morning I walk into the religious community where I work, I feel as if I'm entering a different world as compared to the one where I live with my family in these difficult times. I feel as if I'm entering a world with no money issues, with no accounts in red, with no debts to be paid, with no savings that are necessary, a world with no renunciation of comforts, with no anxieties about tomorrow, with no concerns about work, about the future. In that community, in that religious community where I work, everything is quiet, everything is safe, everything is comfortable, everything is taken for granted. But does the vow of poverty mean a guaranteed sense of well-being? We were talking about collective mediocrity, right? We can no longer give this type of counter testimony, this lifestyle, these scandals, with regard to these two aspects, poverty and virginity, which are very significant in our consecration. We were also talking about the way in which we interpret these scandals. You see how how smart we are. Well, these scandals only refer to a few, not the whole community. You see how smart this mechanism, this defensive mechanism is? It removes the responsibility. This only concerns those who committed the scandals, not the whole community. This is a sign of a general mediocrity, this lifestyle that makes us dumb, unable of expressing compassion, unable of living and feeling the appeal that stems from all the violence before which we should be crying tears that make noise. That is why we are mute and dumb before the reality. That's why we're never sufficiently witnessing this martyrdom, and we are just content with a prayer. I don't want to be lacking respect, but sometimes when we listen to our community prayer, it seems to be a prayer that doesn't even know what it's asking for, because we don't even know what history we are living, or we kind of just mumble some words and using correct liturgical expression to invoke peace, etc. But words and invocations that cannot touch the God of peace unless they are confirmed by our personal experience and find application in the community experience as well. So with no credibility whatsoever before the world, just as tears that make no noise. So it is clear our image that is so important in a vocation promotion becomes less attractive. Think about this. We're still within the prophecy. What strength would there be in a consecrated life that is animated by a true missionary sensitivity, capable of crying with those who cry, especially if this crying is not only done by a single person. That wouldn't make much noise if there's only one person crying. But if it takes on the size of a choral lamentation, a universal lament with many voices in harmony, loud, stronger than those who want to silence it, like a lament expressing the pain of the world. The whole of consecrated life that has learned to cry, female, male, young and old, contemplative and active life, the major orders, the small communities, the traditional institutes, or the new forms of consecrated life. Think if this were a universal lamentation, if we all learn to have a compassionate heart, and if we learn to cry for what deserves crying, this will be a lamentation expressing a major strength. It would be expressing God, the God who is listening to the groan of those who are crying, and he cries for them and gathers their tears. How beautiful would it be to have a consecrated life capable of expressing this face of God, and how disgusting to think about a consecrated life that has become comfortable, wealthy, concerned with its own well-being. As that woman says, I walk into that community and I discover an entirely different world, so distant from my everyday life. Let's seriously think about this. Let's think about the prophecy of this lamentation in a choir, expressing the lamentation of God, one that speaks of its feelings, a compassionate heart that has learned to cry God's tears. We can apply to consecrated life what we could say about a certain Christian education. We've preached resignation too much instead of educating to indignation, for indignation. we've preached too much resignation instead of educating for indignation, that indignation that stems from having a heart such as God's, as the one who sees the poor and feels indignation. An African proverb says, tears hurt when they come back to your eyes, which means when they do not express real pain for others, they only speak of subjective frustration. Those tears are useless and they fall sterile on those who cry. The tears are good and they're helpful when they fall to the ground and drench it, so they can lead to a new and beautiful reality. Those are fertile tears when you learn to cry for the other. It seems Emi Choran seems to echo this proverb when he affirms that on the judgment day, only tears will be weighed. If you haven't cried for the other, you cannot enter the heavens. The tears for the others, cried for the others, and the noisy ones expressing sensitivity for the other's pain. So what formation can we provide in initial formation or through life? It is no longer time to have a modulated choir of the subjective rights, of alternate choirs, with a harp in the background, something very suggestive. It is now time to wake up from our sleep, to raise our voices with the earth, with the skies, to raise our voice with plants, with stones, with that creation that is groaning more than ever, giving the voice to those who do not have a voice. It is a time when we cannot allow prudence to continue strangling prophecy. You see that title? That prudence that is strangling prophecy. It is not excessive. It is impossible to continue saying that we have nothing to do with it, that this whole dramatic story of war, terrorism, abuse, and scandal does not concern our choices, that we have no responsibility. Others must step in, that we just take care of spiritual life. We work on the conscience, that we have to act cautiously in silence, humbly and discreetly, waiting until we see new skies or new lands. And if we have to question ourselves, since we have to seriously reflect on formation, especially ongoing formation, how much room is there for this aspect, for this sensitivity on a path of formation to consecrated life, while we teach so many things to our young people: hermeneutics, sacred languages, legal norms, liturgical rites, communication strategies, pastoral etiquette, charismatic mysticism. I mean, all these are beautiful things, certainly. Why are we not teaching those who try to walk on this path of consecrated life, whether young or not young? Why don't we teach them that there is no safe religious life in existence, a peaceful and quiet religious life? Why don't we teach them that our prayer cannot help us save ourselves, but that it is mixed to the tears that make noise? As the prophet said in the Lamentations, is there a pain similar to my pain? And he wrote this because he could no longer speak it, because writing is like ripping silence off the walls, the the ink in our pens and the keyboard of our computers. What echo does this pain have in those formation spaces that are focused on learning? Learning what? Learning what? What formation are we talking about? What does formation mean? What is it? Is it formation that has the feelings, the thoughts, the sensitivity, the passion and compassion of Jesus? This is real formation, that formation that does not stop at the outside behavior, that does not stop at the attitude and the behavior, that is not content with just offering manners of behaving that are politically correct or liturgically correct. Rather, that formation which follows Paul's words, have in you the feelings, that formation that touches your heart and that forms in us the feelings, the taste, the sensations, the emotions, the affection, the desires, the attraction, the passion and compassion of the obedient Son, the suffering servant, the innocent lamb. This is the formation, whether initial or ongoing. If formation is understood as such, that is to have the feelings, it has to be ongoing. Because if you only have to learn behaviors, and 1 year novitiate is more than enough. But if you need to change your feelings, you will need all of your life, your entire life. The real formation is precisely this one. We are consecrated. My heart has learned to feel the feelings of the Son in a formative process that lasts through life. This is formation. This is the only way of understanding and intending formation. If we see formation of something dramatic, I don't know how much we are living this formation, beginning with the initial one. Why dramatic? Because it is a Paschal formation that progressively leads us into that mystery that takes up our weakness and transforms it with the strength of grace. This is the only formation where you start moving your first steps, knowing that you're going to have to maintain it all your life. So that's what matters, to stay in touch with the suffering of the world. What is asked of you as consecrated person is, first of all, compassion. This is what makes you a consecrated person. Otherwise, it's all fake, it's all pretending, it's just a part. What is the formation that is still being given nowadays? I'm saying this very respectfully, you see, but it is a risk that we are running, and we have to be brave enough to say it. It is a formation that may be of a facade that's just content with the appropriate behavior. Perhaps that gives discounts to facilitate the life of our young people. Oh, there are so few. Let's protect them. Let them not get into a crisis. No, let's meet their needs because they are today's young people. Understand. I'm not saying we have to be harsh and tough and go back to past rigor. No, but I have to decide what it is that I'm doing. Am I giving a message along this line? This young person who has to get into the sensitivity of God, convert her heart, and not just be content with an outside appearance, but needs to evangelize sensitivity. Evangelize sensitivity. Deep feelings. Are we giving, are we providing this formation, or is it something that risks only being an aesthetic secure facade, perhaps more concerned about quantity instead of quality. The first type of formation is what responds to Paul's appeal to have the feelings of the Son, the servant, the Lamb, a formation that forms your heart. The second one forms monsters, as Pope Francis would say. If you do not touch their heart, we're just forming monsters, people with an appropriate behavior, but the heart is elsewhere. Thanks to the first one, we feel the sins of the church and the world as our own. We feel shame. We have the courage to cry for them, to ask forgiveness, to ask for forgiveness for the victims. With regard as to the second one makes us as hard as stones. It doesn't change our heart. This formation of the heart makes us capable of listening to life and to let ourselves be formed. Life speaks if there's a heart that listens. The one limited to outside gestures only makes us blind and mute. The first one transmits trust and prophecy. The second one makes us fearful and uncertain. So let's go back to the prophecy of Ratzinger. The prophecy of Ratzinger lets us understand that authority would never be corrupt by power. Authority is healthy. Power is the deformation, the deforming of authority. If we have to have the same feelings as Christ, we have to learn authority from him. We have to intend it as he interpreted and lived it. It's very interesting. Remember that passage in the gospel where people say that when they felt that Jesus had authority, the simple people said, Jesus has authority. It's not like the Pharisees. Why did simple people recognize this authority in Jesus? Where was Jesus's authority? It's very interesting. People recognized the authority of Jesus in the fact that Jesus felt compassion. This is what gave him authority. Jesus took in the pain of people. It was not just somebody doing prodigious gestures. He got into a relationship of compassion. He was not interested. Simple people recognize this is true authority. This is very interesting because it says that we too, that this is a source of real authority, not in the sense of power, but in the sense that our choice of life becomes significant, believable, authoritative. What is it that gives authority to our choice of life? Precisely this, the capability of feeling compassion. If we manifest this capability to the world, it's a great inner freedom. As I said, compassion means that your heart is free to welcome, to take in at least part of the pain that any person tells you about or that you experience in the world. It makes you feel bad. It is a great test. When a person comes and speaks of her pain or suffering, I listen to this person, I give her my time, I'm welcoming, I say a few good words, but then the person leaves and I go back to work. And what do I feel at the time? What has remained of that pain? If I feel nothing, if I go back to my regular work, it means I heard no one, I listened to no one. I should feel within me at least a little bit, I don't mean everything, but at least a little of the pain that that person has told me about. If I don't feel that, if I do not feel badly about it, I am not consecrated. let's provide this formation that changes the heart, that gives meaning to virginity. It's not just about not knowing a woman or a man. Virginity is precisely for this. It serves this purpose, a free heart, free from concern, so that it can welcome the pain of others. This gives us authority, just like Jesus. People recognized him as someone with authority. And if nobody noticed the year of consecrated life, I don't want to be simplistic. It's perhaps because we have lost this authority, this credibility, this capability of indicating something that comes from above through our life that speaks of God. This is the source of that authority that we are called to live and interpret. That authority that does not stem from the role, from the institutional belonging, the title, the career, uniform, power, money, culture, effectiveness, numbers of visibility, or social frequentation. Oh, we've become important because we befriended important people. How many? Ratzinger speaks about this. He says, enough of this church that walks alongside politics, flirting, sometimes with the right wing or left wing. What an intuition in this man 50 years ago to anticipate this. Sometimes this has happened. We've become friends of important people, thinking that that would give us prestige. That authority that stems from the sensitivity that not only allows us to listen to the other, but to also take into our hearts at least a bit of that pain of that person who's talking about it. That is the authority of compassion. We usually do not put these two terms together. Authority means one thing, compassion is different, but they are together. They fit, the authority of compassion, or the compassionate sensitivity in the real meaning of the word. It's a sign of inner freedom manifested in the sharing of suffering, in the effective pain for the pain of the other. I think this is the typical authority, particularly for the when it comes to the female consecrated life, feminine consecrated life. We've used some feminine metaphors today, the breaking of the waters. I chose them specifically because I knew I was addressing a feminine audience. The consecrated person is not just the one who consoles in the name of God, thanks to her competence. It is the person called to participate to that pain, reliving it in herself as the Son incarnated in the pain of the man, as a Samaritan who took charge of the wounds of that poor person through the sharing of a small and great miracle. Because when a person comes to speak of her pain, and if I take that into my heart, this is a small, great miracle, and the other one realizes it. The other person will leave feeling lighter from that part of his pain he left into the other's heart. This is the prophecy. This is the holiness. We should put some formation attention to this compassion, because we do not necessarily have this freedom in our heart. This would be real freedom. Sometimes we're just content in front of the other's pain. We have just the appropriate behavior of a person who has to be consoling in the name of God. But let's put this, let's set this as an objective in a path of formation, both initial and ongoing, because achieving a heart like this one is a work for that lasts all our life. And if this doesn't happen, authority will become power, or will be deprived of any authority. If we really learned this authority, or this teaching, the magisterium of compassion, Not only the people who confide in us would leave feeling lighter, but by taking their suffering into our hearts, what happens? We will be formed by this, because suffering is forming. Suffering has a high, is teaching, is a high capability of teaching. Somebody will speak if there's a heart that listens. Suffering will be forming if there's a heart that is willing to take it in. And that's how the Father forms in us the heart of the Son. He molds the same image of the Son in us by giving us a heart that is capable of welcoming the suffering of others and making it our own. And when this happens, the miracle of redemption continues. But that's also where our ongoing formation takes place. It means to allow ourselves to be formed, educated, to be in a crisis, to be shaken by the suffering that surrounds us, even by desperation, to the extent that we have to be slapped by life, mission, others, even the situations in life that seem completely negative or enigmatic, but that could become mysterious as the pain in the world. The mystery is part of life, and it is along these peripheries that our formation, our ongoing formation will happen. It is by listening to the world, to the world's pain, that we will recognize and cry for our failures and learn from our mistakes in order to avoid repeating them. Of course, to not feel better than anyone else, but to also experience that mercy that is in our heart, in our missionary announcement, and that makes us merciful in this world that is pitiless and hungry. So I conclude. We began with a prophecy of the well-known Professor Ratzinger. If we see also the importance of this man in this prophecy, it speaks of the freedom of this man's heart. These words also spoke of his wisdom. But we will conclude with a prophecy, another prophecy, a prophecy from a person that counts nothing, who counts nothing. That's me. So this is a prophecy. Actually, let's call it a dream, more humbly. I have a dream. Everything I said, at some point, I insisted on these tears, the cry, this lamentation. How beautiful would it be if it were a choir and not just a few sensitive people? Well, what if the entire consecrated life learned to cry for the pain in the world with tears that make noise? So going back, the title was The Prophecy of Holiness. So I'm dreaming a Sunday filled with sun in St. Peter's Square with Benedict or Francis or John Paul. Let's call him Francis. Francis, imagine a Francis the Fifth or Sixth, because I think we're going to need some time for this. Let's imagine a Francis the Fifth, the pontiff, the Pope of the Roman Church, and in St. Peter's Square on a beautiful Roman Sunday, proclaiming as a saint a whole community, not a single religious. We have enough saints or individual saints, but today we especially need holy communities, saintly communities, people who sanctified themselves by living together, by sharing their lives, even sharing their limits, sins, weaknesses, but living this in a continuous path of integration, even integrating evil, using mercy, because mercy also means sanctity. How beautiful would it be if this Francis V proclaimed a whole community as saint? Not specifically one religious that is better than another, or one, the best sister always in the one same community. No, not in this sense, but just any religious sisters who learned to share themselves in life, God's love, mercy, who learned to be compassionate one with another. A community of saints. This would be a true prophecy, the real dream of the sanctity of consecrated life today, which will certainly have a future, especially if it increasingly is a consecrated life that is lived in a community among people who together learned this compassion that comes from the Eternal One. And I'm finished.
Ringraziamo Padre Cencini.
We thank Father Cencini for this reflection, for this sharing. We now have this moment of dialogue around our tables. Perhaps to help ourselves, we could sort of summarize this dialogue around each table, sharing perhaps one echo, or if there's something from this text, from this sharing by Father Cencini that struck us, that is stayed within us, that is provoking. And the second point would be the possibility to raise a question. Each table perhaps could decide on the echo and the question that we will ask Father Cencini. Do we agree? Okay, we have until 12:30 for this exchange, this dialogue around the tables, for this sharing. And at 12:30, we present these to the whole assembly. So enjoy.